If you could read this.
Oh, this is an enthusiastic supporter of Tom Paine in the 1790s called Citizen Randolph, who wrote a pamphlet that said, "O Paine, next to God, how infinitely are millions beholden to you for this small remnant of their liberties. Caesars, Ferdinands and Tsarinas have fought ferociously to enslave mankind. But it was reserved to you to wave celestial banners on the rights of man over the tottering bastilles of Europe, to break the shackles of a despotism from the ankles of millions, and destroy those yokes of oppression for the necks of millions more as yet unborn."
Is that the kind of response that he got in his time? It's an extraordinary quotation.
That is more high-blown language than commonly found among his supporters, but it has a tremendous range of social class and distribution, his support. I mean, at the other extreme, you can find an anonymous letter which was written by some grumpy person in the Isle of Wight and addressed to a very conservative, very reactionary clergyman, which is signed at the end, "We ham for the rights of man, for the rights of Tom Paine, you bugger." So that, I mean, that's a different kind of language. The enthusiasm was especially for Rights of Man Part 2, which had a whole set of very straightforward social proposals for redistributing wealth, providing old age pensions, providing pensions for the sick, a sort of welfare state model. And this was produced in very cheap editions and had an immense sale. And reading groups were formed in cities like Sheffield, where artisans met together and discussed this section by section. So it was an educational experience for them.
Could many people read in those days? How was his ideas disseminated?
Well, more people could read than one thinks, yeah. And it was possible, of course, also to read passages of this aloud. I mean, that's one of the functions of the reading group, of the discussion group, that this could be read, and as it could be read sometimes in the workshop. If it was a workshop whose process was quiet, you could have a reader, as you did in other countries too. In the early days of the labour movement, the American cigar workers always sort of appointed and paid a reader for them, so that this was a fairly universal practice.
Do you have actual evidence that Rights of Man was disseminated among working people? I mean, do you have?
Oh yes, one does, yes. In a curious way, the government and ruling class inspired campaign against Tom Paine, with Tom Paine burnings. Tom Paine was probably burnt more in effigy than anyone except Guy Fawkes. And all that served to advertise Paine's Rights of Man. I mean, if it was important enough to burn him, let's find out what he's saying. And one comment from Herefordshire in the West Country was that there'd been these Tom Paine burnings, so now there was scarce an old woman anywhere in the county but who was saying, "Who is Tom Paine? What does Tom Paine say?" So that this advertisement was made, and for a brief period it was immensely, sensationally popular and also controverted, also controversial issue.
What was, when we read it today, his proposal seems so mild and so frightening to the powers that be.
Well, Tom Paine is always a bit of a puzzle. He did it more than once. He wrote out in plain, very clear language what people probably had thought already, but had never found expressed before. I mean, he did this in America with common sense. I mean, people were thinking of separating from England, but no one had written about the question so bluntly as Tom Paine did. And with the rights of man, he said, I wondered how something written in a style unusual, unfamiliar to English people would be received. And this question of style is more than style, it's what nowadays it's fashionable to call discourse. The discourse of the 18th century was framed entirely within constitutional premises. That is, if you were a reformer, you had to find a constitutional historical precedent to justify your reform. This was usually the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, or it might go further back. I mean, some radical reformers even went back to Saxon times and King Alfred and dredged up most unlikely precedents, you know, that they produced a picture of Anglo-Saxon England in which the people were in continual session in folk motes, deciding almost, you know, almost as a consensual hobby, their policy. Well, what Paine did is he moved right out of this constitutional framework. He said things which were blasphemous, really, in terms of the British discourse, which, as I say, the radicals had shared. He said that we had no constitution, the English had no constitution. That was absolutely blasphemous to say. He said, a Norman bastard with an armed banditti. Well, I can't remember the exact words he used, but he raided the country, and that made a rascally precedent for anything. I mean, that William the Conqueror had no precedent of right at all. So he argued his case purely in terms of rational need and a rational advantage for society, and dismissed contemptuously monarchy, House of Lords, peers, privilege of all kinds, in a way which not only seemed blasphemous, but was, in the sense that it was actually illegal. You know, you were not allowed to say that there was no constitution. You were not allowed to oppose monarchy in that kind of way, although obviously a lot of people in their secret thoughts did. And when the rights of man was brought to trial, this was really the issue. And of course, the court found him guilty. And that did create problems for reformers in England, because it meant that if they used certain kinds of language, Tom Paine's kind of language, they were liable to a couple of years imprisonment. And imprisonment in those days was imprisonment. I mean, it was in such insanitary conditions, such disease-infested places, that you were lucky to come out alive. It wasn't a question whether it was 1 year or 5. It's just the exposure to these kinds of conditions.
Talk a bit about Carlyle in this context. Carlyle publishing Paine. Yes,
well, when this led at first to withdrawal by the reformers from Paine's Rights of Man a bit, from its language, although they secretly, or quietly, privately supported it still. And then you had Paine supporters up and down the country who had illegal copies of the Rights of Man under the counter stuff, and were very ardent in support and were centres of discussion. right into the next century. And early in the next century you have the attempt to break the ban by simply going ahead and publishing Paine's work. And this is what a man called Richard Carlyle did, who was a free thinker. He was probably more interested in Tom Paine's Age of Reason than he was in The Rights of Man. But he was indomitable and very courageous. And he simply went on and on and on publishing, and he had shops, bookshop, where you didn't actually see the person who sold you the copy. It came through a hole in the back of the shop, so that there couldn't be a prosecution of someone for selling the copy. And he had volunteers who came from all parts to help him sell these things, including his wife and his sister, and some of them served terms of imprisonment as well.
So, as specifically as you can, when the Rights of Man was published, what did the government do?
The government's reaction was very sharp to the publication of the Rights of Man, but it was aided by quasi-private initiatives, the most important of which was the initiative of a man called John Reeve, who formed an association for the preservation of liberty and property against Republicans and levelers. And this was able to you could call it a kind of controlled mob action against prominent reformers in provincial towns who would find themselves with their windows broken and sometimes besieged by hostile crowds, and prosecutions for anyone selling anything of Paine's or with that kind of language, and above all organized bonfires and effigy burnings, which is an old kind of vocabulary of... They employed this vocabulary. It was a popular vocabulary, but they employed it themselves. And you have evidence that local bigwigs and local solicitors and people like that were actually paying their toadies to organize these. And they were ferocious affairs at times. I mean, you had Tom Paine in effigy taken in a cart like a condemned criminal to the gallows through the centre of the village or the town, and then sometimes shot, and sometimes, I mean, it would be an effigy that would be shot, or burned in a great Guy Fawkes type bonfire, or hacked to pieces. You know, this was an event which commanded a lot of interest amongst the populace. I don't think it convinced them of anything. I think it advertised, as I've said.
Did they attack Paine, what's the Latin term, ad hominem, as a person to... They couldn't deal with his ideas. Did they try to attack him as a person?
The attack on Paine as a person tended to be rather later. I mean, there was a ferocious response to the Age of Reason, which was, although Paine maintained that he was a deist, it was seen as a atheist tract, partly because its language was so blunt. I mean, he used very simple and straightforward language, like he said, we are told that Christ was born of a virgin 1700 years ago. Were any country girl today to tell us that she was with child, and she was got with child by a ghost, and that an angel told her so, we would know what to think of it. And that sort of language was quite shocking to people. And indeed may be shocking to people still. And it created some dissension among the Paine enthusiasts because some of them, I think particularly the case of Norwich, were nonconformists, were perhaps Baptists, or in some cases irregular Methodists, and they had to choose between religious beliefs and Paine. And it was as a sword sent to divide. Now, after the Age of Reason, the personal attack on Paine became more pointed. There had already been a bogus biography of Paine, which was scurrilous and was supported by government money. And they concentrated on Paine's alleged drinking, about which I can't give a verdict. I mean, I think he did drink sometimes, but I don't think he was the drunkard that they wanted to portray him. And also upon his supposed general immorality of conduct. And this, of course, followed him to the United States. When he returned from France to the United States at the end of the century, there was a good deal of hostility to him for this kind of reason.
So the black lie stuck in a way.
Oh yes, that's right, yes. Black lies did stick, yes.
Sounds very modern. It sounds modern. What were they so afraid of? What was everyone so afraid
Well,
of?
I think we don't have to ask that so much today as we might have in our simplicity 20 years ago. But we now, I think, understand that a society is controlled more by discourse and conventional belief than it is by force. I mean, the collapse of communism in the last few years is partly just total collapse of the ideology and belief system and discourse limitations of the society. And I think in that sense that if you threaten certain sensitive points in this belief system, you are actually threatening the power of the ruling orders. It's true of that time. I think they had reason to be concerned, because it was an extremely, totally unrepresented and pretty corrupt form of government in the country at the time. And people knew this and had ways of pointing at particular corruptions, but to dismiss the entire England's ancient constitution, mixed of interchecking powers, king, lords and commons, to dismiss all that as a fable was heresy.
Now, Paine, I'm just jumping around, but Paine writes of the Age of Reason for a specific political end as well as he wasn't just talking about religion. Maybe you could talk about that a bit, because it's a little puzzling to me. How does this connect with his overall ideology?
Yeah, Paine, who always found a simple way of sort of getting out of difficulties, simply said, my religion is to do good and the world is my country. A beautiful thing to say, but it was allied to I'm a great admirer of Paine. I mean, I think he remains a profound influence, but he was in some senses shallow and over-optimistic. I mean, he said he couldn't believe that monarchy would survive for more than 20 years in any enlightened country, and that doesn't seem to have turned out true. He also had a supreme faith that if you only abolished privilege, everyone would agree perfectly with each other, you know, there would be no more problems. And I suppose in that sense, the Age of Reason was advancing his political view of ethics, and was an intervention partly influenced by the French situation. He actually wrote it in France when he was in prison and could have come under the guillotine. Or I think he'd written some of it before.
I just want to go back to something you said before. He was very much, if there's a consistency in his life, it's this attack on aristocracy, this attack on privilege, the idea of no deference. Maybe talk a bit about that aspect of it.
Well, it's not just that Paine was hostile to any form of privilege, but the tone, the assured, combative tone in which he developed his argument, that was both impressive and shocking. When he said, and he demanded, what are all these lords paid for? We have lords of this and lords of that, lords of the necessary house, and they are all paid, from taxes, and what do they ever do which is of value to the public? And the frankness and the sharpness of his challenge. I mean, anyone who picks up The Age of Reason today, or his some of his shorter pieces of, for example, his address when he was being tried in absentia, very pugnacious piece of writing. We'll see this. I think they will see this. That it is the tone, as much as what is said, but the tone, the way in which it's said, which I think was shocking.
Change from that.
3.
Talking about lack of deference and how it's not surprising today when Lady Di appears on the Daily Express, but in those days, put it back in those times.
Well, the whole sort of political discourse was very much limited to propertied elite, and this was a cultural limitation as well as an economic and political one, that there were these gates of entry. You had to have classics. You had to be able to quote from Virgil or Ovid, or perhaps more from the historical writers of ancient Rome. And the very idea of Tom Paine, who was a staymaker's apprentice and then not a customs officer, but I think of an excise officer, an ordinary person presuming to take opinions on high political questions, was ludicrous and ruled him out of account straight away. And he wasn't to be ruled out of account, and he managed to get through to a large section of the population despite his disqualification in this sense. So there is this traditional deference and reverence which the people have become habituated to, and one man alone managed to break that down in the Rights of Man, and I think it was an amazing achievement, and it was never put together again. Paine continued to be a central text of radical and reform movements until the second half of the 19th century, and beyond for some people, yes.
You said that, a quote that I love in your book is that it's, along with, I think, Pilgrim's Progress, it's the people had it in their back pocket.
Yeah.
You could say that. That Paine in the 19th century. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I said that there was a heavy repression of reformers at in the later 1790s. And this, together with the fact that we were at war with revolutionary France, made reform seem itself treasonable. So that there was some isolation of the reformers, but they were there still, and their cheap editions of Tom Paine would be in their back pockets. And they would hold discussion meetings and so on. And what happened was that, if you like, the intellectuals of the working class were Paineite, Tom Painite. And when the Combination Acts were passed, which limited trade union activity and rights even further than they had been at the very end of the century, the unions went underground, and the leaders of these underground unions tended to be Tom Painites, so they became extremely influential in the early working class movement in this way. I mean, if you force something underground, it gets very tough and resistant, and that's what happened with Tom Paine. Then, at the end of the French Wars, 1815, when reform activity became more possible again, one of the forms that it took would be great dinners at which the reformers would meet, and they would have successions of toasts to their heroes. And Tom Paine was always number one or number two of these toasts to the immortal memory of the great Tom Paine. And they were very protective of Paine, the Tom Paine supporters. There's a nice story about someone, I think this is in later years, in Chartist years, who had a meeting referred somewhat contemptuously to Tom Paine. And one of Tom Paine's zealous supporters stood up and said, "Mr. Thomas Paine, if you please." He had to be treated with proper respect and deference, yes. So I think it was a leading text for the Chartists, the Rights of Man. You can name a number of the founders of the Chartist movement who were Paine supporters. And I think this continued with the free thinkers, of course, in the case of the Age of Reason. This continued until the time of Bradlaugh, who was a great free thinker of the 1870s.
In a sense, he wouldn't stay dead.
No. And there is an extraordinary sense that some of his very simple, basic ideas of democracy have come alive again. And it's difficult to see anyone who represents as directly the new mood of democratic rights that's sweeping the world than Tom Paine.
Why isn't he in the history books? Why do we see 2 lines of him in an American history book, maybe no line in a French history book, and I don't know about the British history book?
That would require some research to find out why he has not honoured, as one might expect, by historians in various countries. I think one reason is that in Britain he did offend that very powerful segment of opinion, the nonconformist conscience. They never came to terms with Paine, and in another sense, history until late years has always been strongly class biased, and Tom Paine was on the wrong side in the class war. It's true that he never became an object of academic respect in the sense that Burke, I mean, there have been endless learned academic treatises written about Burke and his reflections which Tom Paine's Rights of Man was in answer to. And Burke is treated very solemnly as a major philosophical mind, whereas I think he is pretty confused and haphazard mind myself. But Paine has been given none of this attention. But as I say, your question why, the question why, is not easy to answer. I'll have to do quite a lot of research to find out.
We live in an age of all-powerful states. Paine regarded government almost as a necessary.
Yeah.
What is the... he seems to be embraced by both the left and the right.
Yes. Yes, I think this radical Whiggism, which Paine is an inheritor of, is a breaking apart into two halves of the Whig liberal tradition, which stems from Locke, if not before. And Tom Paine tends to be on the anarchist half. That is, he considered, which I think is an excellent precept, that strong government was a bad thing. Everyone assumes that strong government must be a good thing. Weak government, he says, the business, if you took away what today we would call the state, that is, if you took away the House of Lords, the monarchy, the privileged classes, if you took them away, the business of life would still go on, the business of society would go on probably more successfully than before. If you were to do away with the landed gentry, the great landed aristocrats, the land would still be ploughed and sown and the crops be reaped because they do nothing to contribute to that at all they do is take the rent. And I think this very simple view, which is close to that of a sort of modified anarchism, that is, that the country conducts its own affairs through its own local and regional institutions and doesn't require a heavy and expensive state apparatus. That, I think, is Paine's position.
And here you have in England local governments being abolished and even a more central government in Brussels being applied.
Yes, I think this is contrary to the trend of things, but I think there is a resistance to the centralization of the state today.
Here's a quote, 1982 Daily Telegraph, when they saw a film about Paine. Among decent Englishmen in his time, his name was synonymous for treachery, blasphemy, and debauchery. And I'm not talking about 1882 or 1782, this is 1982. Paine today seems to, in England, how is he understood and his role in the American and other democratic revolution?
Well, I think with people who have some historical understanding, he's got a pretty good name now, but I wouldn't say he was a great popular figure. I don't think the ordinary school kid is told enough about him for him to be that. The very conservative town of Thetford in East Anglia, where he came from, where he was born, now has a statue to him and a very fine collection of his books in the library. So that there's slow recognition gathering way. It's a very conservative town, and I think this is interesting.
course, there was opposition when that statue was put up.
Yes.
The Tory council member called him an unmitigated scamp.
Yes, perhaps I shouldn't. Perhaps it's unfair to Thetford to call it so conservative. It has had a radical mayor recently, and yeah, there are signs of change.
Paine on human rights, we take it for granted these days that humans have rights. Talk about that.
Yes, human rights are very much part of the language of politics internationally, even in China nowadays. And yet, if you ask what are the intellectual inheritance, where does the theory of human rights base itself? It, of course, bases itself on very many sources, but the clearest source of all is Tom Paine, and that I think is terribly important, very significant. His claim for human rights was for all men, including slaves. There wasn't any hedging of it at all. He didn't have any sort of property qualification for electors. He did have a masculine definition of what a human was. It was left to Mary Wollstonecraft to write the Rights of Woman, which didn't take over the whole program and platform of Paine, but took over some of it. And it was also for the demystification of government. And that's one reason that he wrote The Age of Reason, is that for Paine and for others of his generation, priestcraft and kingcraft went together. That priestcraft was seen as a means of upholding the mysteries which were upholding monarchy as well. And so he thought the attainment of human rights required the demystification of the vocabulary and the institutions of the Ancien Régime, or the old regime in England.
I'd like to ask you a personal question. In your work on the history of the British working class, were you excited? Did you discover Paine? Had you always known about him? Were some reading his things that excited you?
I'd always known something about Paine, but I discovered more when I wrote The Making of the English Working Class. Particularly interesting and exciting was the tremendous response to this short book, the second part of The Rights of Man, amongst working people, artisans and shopkeepers and Sheffield cutlers and Norwich weavers and such like.
And this was a new information for you.
Oh yes, I mean it's very, very exciting to look at the papers in the Public Record Office and see the alarmed, terrified sometimes reports from magistrates and spies as to the appalling and sensationally unconstitutional language which these people are using, and the revolutionary fears that this aroused in the ruling class.
So you were sitting in the library reading it.
Oh yeah. Yes, there's loads of them, yes.
Do you remember any, not by heart, but the text or what the gist of some of them were?
Well, the magistrate would write in and say that every collier was going to work with the Rights of Man in his pocket, and these people had lost all deference and respect, and were meeting together and plotting, the magistrate would suppose, plotting the overthrow of the government.
Do you believe in democracy?
Very much, yes, I do. I believe in democracy very much. I don't think of this purely in terms of institutional arrangements, but I think the notion of citoyen, of every fellow human as a citizen. That is, not only as a man, but also as someone carrying duties and rights of citizenship is terribly important. An active sense of democracy, and I think an active sense of democracy is what's lacking in this country today. I think it really has, I think some of the ideas, even of medieval time, of people taking a turn with various kinds of job, of the constable of the parish going in rotation around the farms. The idea of a jury system in which 12 people, any people, at random, just 12 people would have the right to sit as a jury and judge their fellows, could never have been invented in the 20th century. It would have been, the experts would have all have found it absolutely outrageous, ludicrous, laughable idea. And I think that we have lost a lot of the democratic input that we have earlier in our history.
Do you think that individuals in the 20th century can affect change? And could a Tom Paine pop up and write a pamphlet that would topple?
I don't know. I don't know whether this could change or not. I'm quite pessimistic sometimes. There seems to be such power and influence in sections of the media that always overwhelmingly seem to have a majority of the actual ballots behind them. But it's a great mistake to think that the tradition is dead. I mean, it is still alive, albeit as a minority tradition. Okay.
Right. Just one last, because
5.
And go. Cut. Let's do it.
6.
And go. That's perfect. Great.
Thank you. Diantha, we're recording.
Room tone for
One
EP
moment.
Thompson
We're recording room
interview.
tone.